large enough to span the globe, yet small enough to fit inside your ear. You are listening to the TrueRants Network, your weekly digest of information and entertainment from an alternative perspective. Welcome to the future.
And I'm your host, J.L. Vance, riding solo for the time being this week. At the close of episode 2, we did say we were going to be covering a casino issue with a guest who has a really interesting kind of human interest story on an experience he had winning a lot of money at a state-sanctioned casino in Ohio last year and having his winnings stolen from him, and then winning even more money back. It's a really interesting story, and unfortunately we're bumping it to next week or sometime in the near future because this week we are going to be touching on a bit of a breaking issue, and that's the Navy Yard mass shooting that occurred about a week ago. It continues to unfold, continues to receive a lot of treatment in the mainstream media, and it's something that we haven't been able to address here on the podcast, whether it be, of course, this shooting, which is a recent event, or the broader issue of mass shootings in general, and the myriad different issues that encompasses, whether it be gun control or violent culture and so many other topics. So this provides us a platform to hit on all of that. And I intend to take a pretty comprehensive treatment of it, so saddle up because we're going to hit all of this in the next hour or so. Now, I really want to present an overriding theme here from my personal perspective, and that is that the idea of gun control is completely futile. The futility of gun control is something that I want to get across to listeners more than anything else. Now, the risk of seeming insensitive, this is being recorded on Sunday the 22nd. There is a vigil today for the victims of the 13 victims who were shot fatally at the Navy Yard shooting, which occurred on the 16th. Aaron Alexis, a 34-year-old ex-military, ex-Navy reservist who, for reasons that are still potentially unfolding, shot and killed these people on the Navy Yard, which is mere blocks from Capitol Hill. It's a military facility. But despite the fact that this is a sensitive issue, it's one that the alternative and new media has to take on right now, even at this sensitive time, because as we speak, Obama is making a renewed push for gun control. He essentially said over the weekend, Saturday night, that this was an opportunity to revamp efforts at gun control that were abandoned last spring. There was a prolonged effort on the part of gun control enthusiasts and government and media to, of course, take advantage of, in my opinion, the mass shooting that occurred at Sandy Hook last December. And it didn't work out. They were not able to pass the type of legislation that they wanted, mandating background checks and so forth. So this does afford them an opportunity to take another stab at gun control. And if they're going to attempt such a thing at such a sensitive time, it's incumbent upon us to respond in kind and refute their erroneous arguments for gun control. Now, I want to add a caveat here because as we speak, we have the NRA taking to the airwaves at the same time that the government does. And I think the media narrative that we too often see is one that essentially argues that the NRA is the be-all, end-all for gun control, gun rights opinion. And it's important, despite the massive, incredibly influential nature of the National Rifle Association, they're one organization. And it's important that we not give into this narrative where anything that Wayne LaPierre, who is the president of the NRA, anything that he says suddenly becomes the default opinion for those who are for the Second Amendment and gun rights. I think an example of this would be last year in the wake of Sandy Hook, and I'm a fundamentalist for gun rights, and yet I found myself vehemently disagreeing with the NRA policy position, which was to, and of course, for those who forget, Sandy Hook was the elementary school shooting. killed 20 children and 6 adults. And the NRA's position, I think partially because they didn't want to be perceived as weak and they felt like they needed to have a specific actionable position and not just sort of a knee-jerk falling back on the Second Amendment, they said that we should arm schools, that armed police officers should be in every school. And there are so many problems with the public school system as it is. I think adding a police officer around every corner is only going to exacerbate all of those problems, not serve as a solution. So that's just one example, and the NRA hasn't taken any kind of ridiculous policy stance yet on this one, but I think it's an important caveat that the NRA does not speak for every gun rights enthusiast. They are one organization with their own agenda, their own funding issues, their own incredible power in Washington, and there's a lot of problematic things that come with that. So let's not look to the NRA as the be-all, end-all. There's a number of other organizations. You can search them very easily who are smaller and I think more legitimate on these issues. Now, to get into the particulars of this shooting, this is a apparently disgruntled ex-military, ex-Navy member. He used multiple weapons in the shooting, including, I believe the only semi-automatic weapon he used was actually stolen at the scene by he stole it from an armed security guard. Now, according to the reports I've heard, other than this one armed security guard, he didn't really run into the opposition until several minutes later when, of course, the police showed up. This is sort of the classic narrative. By the time the police arrived, of course, he had already been able to kill 13 people and wound several others. Aaron Alexis was able to enter this Navy Yard. He passed numerous recent top security clearances despite multiple red flags behaviorally in the recent past, and I think I saw that there were at least 10 incidents, according to the Navy, that raised red flags, several of which involved guns. He's lived in a few different places, and he's had numerous really weird incidents that cast doubt on his mental health and his ability to wield a firearm with any sort of responsibility. And yet, none of that seemed to stop him from waltzing right into this Navy Yard, this military facility that, like I said, is mere blocks from Capitol Hill. This is right in the heart of Washington, D.C., right in the heart of the government. He came in with a bag, with the gun inside the bag, and got right in. And I think this cuts to the issue of what I wanted to get to, which is the idea that gun control is a solution. Now, let's tackle the issue of, first of all, of accurately defining gun control, because I think it sounds a lot better than it actually is. Of course, gun control is merely taking more guns from the free populace of the United States and centralizing them in the government. Now, if you've been able to listen to the podcast for the first few weeks, you know my opinion of the government. And that's that they, at worst, or at best, they suck at everything they do. At worst, they're downright evil. Now, this, in my opinion, isn't the group of people that you want to trust with a monopoly or even anything approaching a monopoly on firearms. And that's the central conceit of gun control. And as I explained to you how easy it was for this individual to... Now this didn't happen, in this case, at a mall, or a theater, or a private home, or anything of that nature. This is a government building that he got into. This is an ex-government guy. This is a guy whose life is inextricably caught up with government. Government dropped the ball on this. And so it's strange to me to hear cries for the government to take the forefront in addressing what happened when they're the ones who dropped the ball. Now, like I said, he passed every background check. This includes federal and state background checks. Now, these are the beloved things of all, particularly progressives and liberals. Guess what? We already have them, and they didn't work in this case, despite major red flags. Waltzed right in. At one point, the Navy, and of course the military is the government, gave him an honorable discharge. They apparently contemplated giving him a regular discharge. I'm not sure what the difference is, but he received an honorable discharge. He was recently treated for mental health issues by, you guessed it, the Veterans Administration, the government. So they had treated him as recently as last month, in August, and they prescribed him an antidepressant. And this is another common motif in a lot of these shootings, is the presence of anti-psychotic drugs. And we could weigh the pros and cons of this on a separate podcast. It's an issue unto itself. And yet, interestingly enough, recently a study came out from the establishment medical community, and this is something that we rarely see. They finally started to cast doubt on the sheer insane level of the use of these drugs, antipsychotic drugs, and it wasn't as if the medical establishment was coming out against them. I mean, they're very much a go-to solution for any number of medical problems, including regular sort of acting out behavior among children and dementia among older people, but it began to at least strike a cautionary note saying perhaps these are overprescribed. And in the case of mass shootings, now certainly tons and tons, millions upon millions, a huge chunk, maybe a tenth, I believe, according to the numbers of Americans do take antidepressants, and they're not all doing mass shootings. I'm not saying that. But I think that this can be an additional factor in somebody with a mental health issue who might already be predisposed to violent behavior. These drugs might make this individual more numb to reality and more likely to do something this drastic. It said that he suffered from insomnia, that he heard voices, and had recently even told individuals that he was being pursued by some types of shadowy figures who were sending, quote, vibrations into his body. I mean, this was a disturbed individual. He suffered from paranoia, generally speaking. So there were any number of red flags here that the government themselves, more than anyone, should have caught. So it's very bizarre to me to hear calls for the government to address the very issues that they let slip through their fingers. I think that is counterintuitive. But to switch gears a little bit, I also want to touch on the media treatment of this, and it's been much the same as it usually is. The corporate media in general is all but in bed with the government. It has what I believe could best be described as a symbiotic relationship with the government. And they're essentially advancing the same pro-gun control agenda. And there's always the mantra of, do something. That's essentially the message. And so they play up every shooting as much as they can. And you know, not to discount the severity of this, but everyone is played up, and this is as much about ratings as it is them actually caring about anybody. Any sort of human misery is sexy. It brings in ratings. They have a vested interest in keeping us afraid. That's why they're going to play up every shooting, even though your chances of being shot in a mass shooting are, likely less than that of being struck by lightning. You should be afraid, just like you should be afraid of terrorism. And so I think this hits at a broader issue that I wanted to touch upon, which is the degree to which the corporate media dictates reality to us. The very parameters of our reality. Now, I think it was a few years ago I had a conversation with some family members who were sort of having the response I think a lot of people have when they watch cable news, which is, what's wrong with the world today? This sort of response. And I would say there's nothing wrong with the world. This is, you're watching, CNN. You're watching a very controlled glimpse of what's supposedly happening in the world. CNN and, the other networks who overall are owned by just a handful of big, massive media conglomerates have a vested interest in presenting a certain version of reality to you, not reality itself. They have a vested interest in portraying a world that is darker than it is. They're not going to show, for every mass shooting that's happening, there's tons of other things, both good and bad, that are happening at the same time that are not going to be covered by CNN. So I think with my family, I was talking about one of the Natalie Holloway-esque events. I mean, I don't remember which girl it was this time. It's sort of the pretty white girl syndrome of the mainstream media, where every time a young girl who typically is Caucasian and blonde is abducted, it's a huge multi-month-long story, which of course is them a source of revenue for them. And it's, kids are dying all over the place every day, all over the world. Why the lightning, the laser focus on this one girl? I found it odd that my family members were watching this and getting invested in this, and this is just one event. Yes, it's tragic, but it's one event that the media has a vested interest in having you obsess over for the purpose of ratings. And the same thing applies with these mass shootings. It is a version of reality that is being presented to you, not reality itself. Now, I want to touch on an article that I found, which is via Bloomberg. And it cuts to what I'm talking about, because it gets to the issue of whether these mass shootings are as common as we think they are. Now, I know it seems, because of the hysteria that I'm talking about in mass media, in corporate media, that it's almost as if every other day there's a mass shooting now. But this actually isn't the case if you're able to step away from this mainstream media lens and the hysteria and the emotional reaction and actually look at some of the facts. Now, this is an article via Bloomberg. I would really encourage everyone to check it out. It's titled "Mass Shootings Fuel Fear, Account for Fraction of Murders." This was dated September 16th. Now it opens. Mass U.S. shootings, such as the bloody rampage at the Washington Navy Yard, spur safety concerns and garner intense media attention, while statistically accounting for few of the total murders reported nationwide. Now, in the 30 years through this past March, 78 public mass shootings occurred in the United States. And for the purposes of this data, we're talking about incidents which involve 4 or more people killed at random by a gunman killing indiscriminately. This comes out of the Congressional Research Service, the people trying to give you gun control. These crimes don't include gang-related killings or domestic disputes where a person slays relatives or other people linked to the assailant. We're talking about just mass shootings. Now, the mass slaughters listed in the report caused the deaths in the last 30 years of a grand total of 547 people. Now, over the same 3 decades, through 2012, we're talking about less than 0.1% of the ultimate grand total, 559,347 people that the FBI estimates were murdered overall in America. Now, just chew over that for a minute. I mean, when you look at it from that perspective, it gets to another issue that is cited in this article, which is that there is no epidemic of mass shootings statistically, despite this intense laser-focused coverage of them. Now, in the research, they even used a broader definition of mass killing than the research service report that I just referenced. This research looked at any homicide resulting in 4 or more deaths, regardless of the motive, which included killings in domestic disputes and robberies gone bad. Even including that data, the reports indicated no increase in mass killings in recent years. There is no epidemic. It's crazy to contemplate. It's just that people in previous cycles, even as recently as a few years ago, but especially in prior decades, were not wired into this 24-hour cable news environment where everything is emphasized in such a hardcore manner in order to bring in ratings. Now, yes, mass shootings are occurring, and every one of them is a tragedy. And one mass shooting is worse than no mass shootings. But the idea that they're taking off is statistically, according to this data, erroneous. So to look at this and think, oh my God, we're getting more and more mass shootings, that's just not yielded out with the actual data. And there's been no indication to date that any of these mass shootings are related in any meaningful way. Now, just as much as anyone, I do fear that copycat idea, but even that so far really hasn't been seen. I mean, there hasn't been a whole lot of indication in any of the evidence that any of these mass shootings were inspired by a previous mass shooting. So everyone just really needs to pump the brakes for a little bit and opt out from this idea that this is a pervasive epidemic. It simply isn't, according to the data. Now, to jump into the background check issue. This is sort of the beloved, at least flavor of the month, flavor of the year, solution among statists, among liberals and progressives, pro-gun control people of all stripes, even pro-gun control conservatives. It's the go-to solution. And their sort of argument is that we don't want to take anybody's guns, we just want quote-unquote common sense solutions to the problems of violence that we're facing. And their favorite son, from an idea perspective, is gun control. Now, they're going to be a little hard-pressed to use this particular shooting, I think, and usually they have problems with all of these shootings because most of them involve stolen guns or guns that they received from friend or acquaintance, family member, what have you. So the background check issue rarely applies anyway, and in this case, it certainly doesn't apply because Alexis passed both state and federal background checks, as I said before. Now, this cuts to more of a philosophical issue because I take the libertarian perspective on gun control, which is that you can have gun control in a sense in the free market. Now, merchants can run their own gun control, and in a free market, I think that there could potentially be some incentive to do this. I mean, if you're a private gun merchant, if you want business, you don't want to have the reputation in the market of being someone who sells guns to crazy people. That's not good for business in a free market setting, which of course we don't have. But to talk philosophy for a minute, to talk ideally how things could be, private merchants could run their own background checks, and that could consist of whatever it might consist of in the free market. And the person making the purchase can either choose to opt into that or not. And if they're troubled at the severity of that background check, they can go to another merchant. And you'll get forces of supply and demand in the marketplace that decide best practices for this kind of thing. Nobody wants to sell guns to crazy people. And it wouldn't happen in a free market. So the idea that the government is the be-all, end-all, it's another area where that's simply erroneous. Now, this is going to cut into the broader issue for me because like I said, gun control is supposed to be one of these quote-unquote common-sense moderate measures. And I want to posit the question, is any form of gun control, including the smallest of measures, which, of course, I'm talking about state-sanctioned gun control to make a transition. I'm no longer talking about private background checks, which are an entirely separate issue, because they're private merchants deciding whom they want to sell guns to, which is perfectly legitimate. When you bring the government into the equation, then you have problems. So the question I want to posit is any form of gun control, regardless of the sweeping or small nature of it, is it legally, morally, and ethically acceptable? My answer to that would be no. I think it's really important that we have clarity on this issue. If you have a populace who has any impediments from the government to defending themselves, to arming themselves, to keeping themselves safe, if they choose, then you fundamentally have a nation of slaves. And there is nowhere you can land on that continuum that is acceptable, other than absolute freedom. The current paradigm is not acceptable. Now, there's a lot of debate over the original intentions of the Second Amendment. I find the entire debate totally absurd. The idea is that, the Second Amendment and possibly other aspects of the Constitution are now outdated because the founders could never have accounted for AR-15s and semi-automatic weapons. And this sort of came to the forefront in this most recent shooting because early reports that were totally unfounded and came out of I don't know where said that Aaron Alexis used an AR-15 in the shooting. He did not, it came out. So I'm not sure where that came from. I think that was just wishful thinking on the part of people who want to advance this automatic weapon narrative. Now, as I said, mass shootings count for a fraction of overall murders. To hit another related issue, I think another favorite that gun control enthusiasts like to cite is other countries, particularly, especially with like Piers Morgan recently, the United Kingdom. Piers Morgan talks up the UK all the time. Now, the United Kingdom does have strict gun control, and full disclosure, I mean, they do have less gun violence, of course. Eventually, this is going to bring down gun violence. But what often gets glossed over by those who cite these numbers is that the overall rate of violence in the country has risen and is higher than that in the United States because of this gun control. A lot of people make fun of the narrative that the good guy with a gun, is a solution in the room to check the bad guy with the gun. But all of the statistics yield out that this is indeed the case. And it really cuts to the issue, and they recently hit on this rather wonderfully on The Daily Show, of just speculation. Where, like I said, the mass media is so hung up on ratings that they need to cover this event as soon as it's on their radar. And it doesn't matter if they have zero information about what's occurring. So they speculate about any number of things. Did he have an AR-15? Is he a Muslim? Is he a Tea Partier? We see this all the time. And the speculation also included whether or not there had been multiple shooters. And this is another common motif. We see this in nearly every shooting. And I don't know if it's just a desire among law enforcement to make sure that they've apprehended every suspect, or if it's just media-fueled speculation. I mean, this does come out of law enforcement in this case. Multiple shooters. We saw this in the Batman shootings with James Holmes. But what I found interesting in this case is they had two specific, very specific descriptions of two other shooters who were supposedly involved in this, and they ended up calling off both. I'm not sure why they were on camera or why they were suspected, but it's a bit odd. Now, another angle that I would hit on is the fact that, of course, in the United States we have a federalist system. There is not just the federal government, we have state governments as well. And what we're seeing in the wake of Newtown last year, the Newtown shootings, is a story of almost two Americas at the state level. Because we've got an issue, and this is also cited in the Bloomberg article, where 20 different states, roughly, have tightened gun control since last December in the Newtown shootings, whereas 27 have loosened restrictions at the state level. Now, that's incredibly interesting, because I tend to be skeptical of governments of all flavor, but of course, those governments that are closer to you, the state government, is at least going to be incrementally more accountable. So it's interesting that a bigger number of state governments have loosened gun restrictions at the state level than tightened them. I'm rather flabbergasted by that news. I think it bodes well. But to get back to the good guy with a gun idea, and this one is a little more personal for me because this occurred last year here in Portland at the Clackamas Town Center Mall. We finally had a real-life example of that come into play. As, despite the fact that the mall, and this is an entire other issue, the mall was of course a gun-free zone. Every time we see a shooting, it's invariably at so-called gun-free zones. The Navy Yard was a gun-free zone, most malls are, most theaters are. Of course, James Holmes went out of his way to go to a gun-free theater, when a theater that was actually closer to where he resided, he probably might have potentially gone to, permitted guns, so he chose to drive out of his way to go to a gun-free zone. And the Clackamas Mall Center, despite being a gun-free zone, there was a customer there near the shooting who did have a private firearm on his person, and he briefly brandished it, and we can't say for sure if this changed things, but most likely it did, because immediately thereafter, the shooter killed himself. Now, he might have been planning on killing himself all along, but he might have taken far more victims with him before he decided to do that. So there's your example of how that gap of time between the police arriving is make or break for any number of people in this type of situation. And having people who are responsible gun owners who choose to carry a firearm on their person in that situation is invaluable. Unfortunately and tragically, that's too often not the case. But in Portland on that night, it was. Now, gun control itself is the ultimate attempt at a quick fix. And what I want to get into is I want to ask the question of whether there can be a quick fix with the sort of dysfunction and potentially evil that we're dealing with these mass shootings. I don't think that there can be. I think that gun control is an obvious and very appealing and seductive quick fix. And the true futility of it isn't just that it's the government which sucks at everything that it does. It's that even if gun control might work in any meaningful way, which it won't, there are more foundational aspects of our society that need to be addressed in lieu of these types of events. And I can't hit on all of them right here, but it's as foundational as parenting. Now, I'm going to be guilty of my own speculation here, but I'm willing to guess that Aaron Alexis had a dysfunctional childhood. And knowing a lot more about psychology is important for everybody in this. It's as important as knowing about politics, because psychology predates politics. All of these sociopaths in the government probably had bad childhoods. So parenting and the breakdown of the family unit, mental health as an issue, and the issue of disassociation, especially in increasingly technology-crazed society where certain individuals begin to feel disassociated and they slip further and further out of reality. The issue of violent culture, and not just violent pop culture, that's more superficial, of violent culture in general, the militaristic nature of American society today. We are constantly at war. We have an entire generation of young people right now who have grown up in an America that has never been not at war, to use a double negative. And there's no reason to think that they're going to see an America that's not at war in their lifetime. Now, most people are unplugged from this. We just absorb pop culture, and sickly enough, even while America is at war, we have these same children and young people who are totally removed from the realities of that militarism, that sick militarism, and yet they're playing games like Call of Duty and these insanely popular games that are ultra-realistic depictions of war. Now, how odd is that? And I'm a total libertarian. I would never call for censoring any type of culture or art, including video games. But there's certainly a role for parents here. And much like the antidepressants, you have millions upon millions of Americans playing games like this and other games. And of course they're not going out and shooting anyone. That alone is not going to cause such a thing. But once again, like the anti-psychotics, I think it's worth considering that, because in this issue as well, it was said by, I think, one acquaintance or friend that Aaron Alexis obsessively played such games. Now, could this have, on top of his existing mental health issues, desensitized him and brought him further away from reality? And if it's capable of that, what does that say about the violent realism of these games? It's worth thinking about, particularly for parents at least. Not blaming video games, not at all, but just considering this. But to get back to what I was talking about, I would just posit that American culture itself is, at its heart, diseased. We're incredibly militaristic. People are obsessed with materialism, vanity. What they own and what they absorb in pop culture and just endless superficial things is more important than their basic humanity. And they're checking out. They're not concerned with what's going on in the world. They're not concerned with philosophy, with values, with ideas. Everything is dumbed down. We're stupid and we're violent. And I think as this empire continues to grow and we become more and more like ancient Rome and more in a bread and circus mentality. You're going to see incidents of what I would dub the lost children or the orphans of the empire, lashing out. People who are utterly disassociated by this pervasive, diseased culture. And it begins to come home to roost for so many people who think that they can turn a blind eye to the true horrors of our culture, because they become the victims when this manifests itself in a violent, crazy episode. Because I think our cultural landscape is a fertile breeding ground for these types of monsters. Whether they're doing a self-aware act of evil, or whether they're just so deluded and so detached from reality and basic humanity that they don't even know what they're doing. And I don't know in the case of Aaron Alexis which is the case. But it gets into mental health, which I think is perhaps the most important of these alternative issues to a government-mandated solution. I want to raise the question of whether our society and or our government, I would say more importantly our society, needs to change, or better yet evolve, their attitudes about mental health. Now, I would posit that undiagnosed mental health issues probably account for so many of the world's ills. And yet, we still have these pervasive, I think, outdated stigmas about mental health. There are entire families who sweep these issues under the rug and ignore them because they're ashamed. And mental health is just like physical health. Things go wrong with people's minds. And to sweep that under the rug, to push that aside, to marginalize that, when you consider that the human brain is the most important part of someone's health, mental health is more important than anything, is an incredibly vicious and costly trend. And I think we see that in the case of Aaron Alexis, where people close to him, and I think probably as his life wore on, he had fewer people who were genuinely close to him for obvious reasons. They don't address these red flags. They just chalk it off and say, well, this person is weird. This person is idiosyncratic. He's bonkers, whatever. And we see that in so many of these shootings, where sometimes the shooter does still have a rather robust social life or family life at the time of the shooting, and yet there are these individuals who either missed the red flags altogether or decided to just totally sweep them under the rug. And I think that's so fundamentally tragic, and something that we can do so much more about. Whereas gun control is such an abstract and futile idea. But talking to your friends and family when they exhibit issues relative to their mental health, to not do that, I mean, that's something so simple, and something that supposedly, if this is a person that you love, you would be willing to do. And so I wanted to hit on that. And I think what we see here too often are two extremes, two polar opposite responses to an event like this. There's the sort of uber-liberal response that I would call that of the apologist. And perhaps I'm being perceived as taking that response right now. I'm not. Aaron Alexis is guilty of a heinous act, of course. But the apologist would use almost no critical thought. They would simply say, this person is a victim, completely and utterly, of his culture, of his upbringing, of his education, of the medical community, of what have you. And yes, all of that is relevant, as I've laid out. But to say that that person has no moral agency at all, well, that's a cop-out. Now, in some cases, yes, some of these shooters are so deluded that they are totally out of touch with reality. And in that case, I think it's a bit short-sighted to just dub them as evil. I mean, they're deranged. There's a difference there, because there's a lack of moral agency. And this hits on the other extreme, which I would describe, as opposed to the apologist, as the executioner. Now, this is sort of the uber conservative stance, which is just sort of to write this off and just say, well, he's an evil douche. He was just an evil fuck. Thank God he's dead. What a coward. And that's a very seductive stance to take for normal people who would never do something like this. I myself have taken it in the past. And yet it too is short-sighted in that it doesn't look at the broader issues that we're talking about here. To look at issues of family and culture and mental health and education and pop culture and all of these things is not to explain away a person's actions, but it is to find out how this person, despite their evil act, might have gotten there. Because people don't come out of the womb evil. They might not even embark on adulthood evil. And to simply write it off and say, well, this is a satanic evil fuck, is to basically invite another event of this kind by not trying to understand what leads to this. To try to understand is not to excuse or to apologize for. So I wanted to hit on those two extremes. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't quickly hit on, considering that as we go forward with the show, we would like to hit on some more esoteric subjects, including aliens and the paranormal, things of this nature that are a little more fun, not quite as sobering as what I'm talking about right now. I do want to hit on conspiracies again. Of course, we opened the program 2 weeks ago with a discussion about 9/11 conspiracy theories, but as we go forward, a lot of these shootings are yielding their own conspiracy theories. Some of them are at least initially valid, in the sense that so many of these shootings, oddly enough, occur so close to, you guessed it, the government. I mean, both Columbine and James Holmes occurred in the Denver area, which is sort of the unofficial reserve capital for the United States government, first of all, in the event of a cataclysm. It's really the main hub. I mean, there are things in Nevada and Utah and Montana and elsewhere, but it's the main hub other than the Pentagon for the military. There's so many things going on there. And it's a place where James Holmes, for instance, which, to remind you, was the Batman shooter, was working in a graduate program, I believe in neurobiology, that did receive funding from the Pentagon. So you do have to wonder, when you consider that they've scrubbed so much of the details that came out of the James Holmes shooting. Federal agents raided his apartment and they black-bagged so much of what was there, including potentially meds that he was taking. And who knows what other evidence. You know, I think it's a fair question to ask, was James Holmes some sort of guinea pig, at the very least? And this cuts into an issue, and I think my co-host wanted to hit on this, at least in the future, if not on this particular issue, but he was having a discussion with a friend about the CIA's MK-Ultra program. And if you haven't heard of this one, it's worth Wikipediaing at the very least. This was a program in, I believe, the 50s or 60s that explored mind control. And it's now shut down. Now, of course, it's important to keep in mind that typically when intelligence agencies say that they have ended an operation, a program like this, they've simply renamed it. I think of an organization like the CIA wanted to explore mind control. In the 50s, they would be just as invested in doing it now. We know a lot about how they operate, so there's no reason to think that they wouldn't be. But essentially what this involved was trying to program people, to turn them into mindless assassins. And it's really sick because I'm not an expert on these things, but the central aspect of doing this, and it seems so crazy and so impossible to program someone, you know, whether it's through hypnosis or what have you. But what it involves essentially is torture. You torture someone to the brink of their sanity so that they lose touch with reality. And you build up so much trauma in them that a whole space of their brain is consumed with that trauma and that madness. And you take that area, that hurt, wounded area of their brain, and you fill it with what you want them to do. Now, it's an odd idea. I should probably have a neurologist on the program if possible at some point to explore how valid this is. But considering the proximity of so many of these shootings to government, Fort Hood, of course, occurred in 2009 on a military base. You do have to wonder from a conspiratorial standpoint why this is occurring. Timothy McVeigh was ex-military. The DC sniper, I believe, was ex-military. I mean, we see this so often, and in some cases, yes, they've seen action overseas, and they come back with PTSD and mentally scarred, and I understand that. But some of these individuals, like Aaron Alexis, didn't see combat, to my knowledge. And yet we always see this in government, whether it's the LAPD shooter recently. And it does make you wonder if the government did want a sufficient event to launch gun control. Would they be willing to program someone and stage an event? I personally don't think that's been the case here or in any other incident. And I think it cuts back to what we talked about with the September 11th issue, which is, even if that is the case, does it ultimately matter? That's the question I asked 2 weeks ago. Because I think the gun control agenda would be marching along regardless. Whether you have an organic event of a random crazy person or a programmed government assassin, it makes no difference because the same agenda is being advanced in response to that shooting. So it's almost a waste of time to dither over this unless we have concrete information. Now, if leaks come out that shed light on this, much like the NSA leaks, then I think that's fair game. But until then, we might as well be focusing on the gun control agenda that's spawned by this than worrying or contemplating whether or not this might have been government engineered directly. It's sort of futile to spend too much time on that. But to get back once again to the issue of government and trusting them as the gatekeepers of firearms, I mean, the government in the last century or so, there's been one entity on Earth, one human entity that has killed more people, more innocent people, than any other. It's not any gang. It's not a mob. Well, it is a mob, but we'll get to that. It's not random assailants. It's not religious cults. It is the government. Not just the American government, but government in general, is estimated to have killed around 250 million people in the last 100 years. And I would argue that the American government is no less evil fundamentally. It's just as scarred. It's just as run by sociopaths and psychopaths. They're a little bit more limited by the Constitution and a more educated citizenry. That's increasingly not the case on both fronts. But the idea that we should trust this nefarious entity with policing who is able to own firearms, the idea that you would have a gun background check system at the federal level that would not, by default, turn into a federal registry of gun owners is insane. If you don't think that would be the case, you are utterly naive, especially in light of recent events where we learned that the government is spying on everyone. Of course, they would say that they're not keeping a federal registry of gun owners, but what they say doesn't matter. They would, of course, have that. Don't be naive on this. Now, to hit back on the Second Amendment, there are attempts on the left to sort of rewrite things and say that, well, like I said, the government could, or the founders could never have accounted for AR-15s and semi-automatics. And, of course, the militia wording, which, if only libertarians had a time machine to get in the ear of the founders a little bit, because it's very obvious what they were trying to say. And yet the wording is used now by statists to sort of muddy the waters a little bit. But it's very clear, and even the Supreme Court, which drops the ball on all sorts of things and makes all kinds of insane statist rulings, ruled in recent years that the Second Amendment applies to individual ownership of firearms, not just militias. So, this cuts to a philosophical issue, which is that, because of the advent of technology, the Second Amendment is outdated, when the actual moral issue here is that a free people should be able to have every sort of weapon and every sort of tool at their disposal that their government has in a system that's supposed to be by and for the people. So if in 1798 or thereabouts that was muskets, then the people were also allowed to carry muskets. And in 2013, if that's semi-automatics, and I certainly wouldn't purchase one, I would not advise anybody to. I don't think it has a lot of utility. But you should be able to, because if the state can have it, you should be able to have it. Otherwise, like I said before, you are a slave. If you have a government, if you have rulers who can have weapons that you're not allowed to have, you, my friend, are a slave. You can try to run from that reality or deny it, but you are. Now, I want to cut to the issue of pacifism as well, and what I would call real pacifism versus a sort of fake, unthinking pacifism. Now, I'm committed to nonviolence. That's why I'm against the government, because the government is an inherently violent entity, and that's why I think it's insane that you would call for the government to institute gun control. Now, what we see in response to so much of this is this sort of bewildered, incredulous response from leftists that say, your solution is more guns? Are you crazy? Well, yeah, my solution is more guns. In the short term, certainly. I mean, education, more robust families, thinking about our violent culture, all of these things matter. But, yeah, in the short term, when an event is going down, having a person in the room who is armed, and this includes September 11th. I mean, all of this could have been prevented if people were able to carry firearms, if the airlines were privatized. And I know that to the layman that can sound crazy, but the average person has no incentive to hijack a fucking airliner. However, they do have every incentive to defend themselves against a terrorist organization doing same. Now, it's important to analyze this problem rationally instead of just acting out emotionally. Because on a basic emotional level, of course it sounds insane to talk about more guns. But when you're analyzing this rationally, you know that the gun control argument is just about giving more guns to the government, and that free people having more guns makes everyone safer. And of course the caveat to this is, I'm not just willy-nilly saying everyone, kids, the mentally disabled should be able to have guns. No, I want a responsible citizenry of gun owners. This means if you are going to choose to carry a firearm, and I don't, by the way. I don't own a firearm, I never have. I've never shot one. I've shot a BB gun, but I understand and endorse the idea of self-defense and the right to do it if you choose. We should have a society where people treat firearm ownership as the sober responsibility that it is, and take classes, not government-commanded classes, but classes they choose to take because they want to educate themselves and they don't want to hurt themselves or their family on accident. We're not a nation of stupid random people that just randomly kill people just because we own firearms. Now, as we talk about the government, I want to touch on the issue of what I would call, for lack of a better term, backdoor gun control. Which is, even as we've seen the failed attempt at the president and Congress to pass something substantive on gun control, the government is taking very concrete measures, mostly behind everyone's back, because these issues are not getting mainstream coverage for very obvious reasons, because the corporate media does not want you to know about this. We have the Department of Homeland Security, which is increasingly a fascist police state apparatus. It has been from day one. I think that was always the intent with the DHS. They are here for you, my friends. They are not here for terrorists. This is increasingly evident. All of their MOs point to it. They're buying ammo, and they're buying ammo at astounding rates. Now, if you can't get rid of 300 million guns, you can certainly dry up the flow of ammo to fire those guns for the public. And the Department of Homeland Security, in recent years, has purchased enough ammunition to kill every man, woman, and child in America multiple times over. Now think about that for a moment, and consider that I'm not even talking about the Army or the Pentagon. I'm talking about the Department of Homeland Security. They're supposed to be on defense. Now, what the hell are they preparing for? Is there an invasion that's imminent that I'm not aware of? It's very obvious what they're preparing for. They're preparing for social unrest here in the United States, whether it comes as a response to economic calamity, natural disaster, war, or whatever it might be. That's what they're preparing for. They're preparing to police you. Now, we've seen, it also came out that they have drills where they've done target practice that has old people and children depicted as the targets. Now, these aren't your standard terrorists. It's very clear what they're preparing for. And yet, with these ammo purchases, they couldn't even use this ammo even if they wanted to in the event of a police state crackdown on social unrest in this country. Because, like I said, they have more than enough bullets to kill everyone multiple times over. They're buying this much ammo to dry up the supply. And because they're the government, and they have an endless bottom line of revenue, so they just keep buying. Because, fuck it, they can just tax more, and they can just print more money via the Federal Reserve, so they don't have a bottom line like a business. They're buying all of this ammo so that you can't. And this is basically a form of backdoor gun control. Now, what we've also seen more recently are quiet executive orders passed by Obama that certainly don't achieve, I think, what they wanted to, but are incremental steps to crack down. And those executive orders have been passed recently. Slowly tightening the noose, slowly curbing gun rights. And that's in addition to an entire framework. The idea that the United States doesn't have gun control is insane. The Newtown shootings happened in Connecticut. This is one of the strictest gun control states in the country. We have a labyrinthine set of interstate rules, federal and state rules that police how you can buy guns, whether you can take guns over the border of one state to another, whether you can buy guns in a certain state if you're a resident of another. There is an endless tapestry of these rules. They do nothing to prevent these events, and they never will. So to wrap up what I'm talking about, and to bring the overarching theme home, which is, should the government, a violent, corrupt entity, be trusted with more guns? That should be the question we're asking. Not should people have more guns, should the government have more guns, or more importantly, a higher ratio of the guns that exist. Recently, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, raided some hatchery or something in Alaska. And when I say raided, I mean that the EPA violently raided this fishing spot over some random, stupid, bureaucratic misstep on their part, some perceived crime that I'm sure was a technicality. But what really came out of it, and what was most telling, is that most people didn't know that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has an armed division. And what came out with this is that there are more than 70 federal agencies that have armed divisions in the United States federal apparatus. This includes the Library of Congress, the Department of Education. This is insane. I'll tell you who's obsessed with guns. It is the feds. So anybody who thinks the feds can be trusted with gun control is incredibly naive. They are the trigger-happy ones, my friends. And so we as people, as free people, are supposed to be more afraid of random shooters or terrorists? No. I'm afraid of the people who are saying they're here to help. I'm afraid of these 70-plus agencies who are armed to the teeth for no reason. They are the ones obsessed with guns. They are incredibly incompetent in everything they do. The only thing they are good at is killing and stealing things. And so to trust them with policing guns is insane. Let's do our own private gun control. Let's educate people about whether they should or should not own guns in their private situation. Let's choose whether or not we want to own guns. Let's allow private businesses to choose whether they want guns to be sold there. Let's let private merchants decide whether they want to run their own private background checks.